My name is Ted Kapchuk. I'm the director of the program in placebo studies. Thank you for coming out on such a cold afternoon. I have a very few words just about the where this seminar comes from and a few housekeeping issues. I wanted to say this seminar is the third in a series of seminars that the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation has supported. The Robert Wood Foundation, the Pioneer Fund, gave us a grant that said work in placebo is really interesting, but there's so many other people in the world that have things that have knowledge, analytic plans, ideas about how to think about placebo that you're not tapping into, and maybe they can use some of the ideas you're using and thinking about and what you're discovering. So it's a way of expanding the dialogue. The first seminar was in June 24th, 25th, and it was called The Science of Placebos. It had neuroscientists from around the world talking about the neurobiology of the placebo effect. There was a small seminar attached to it, which was those scientists and other scientists asking what don't we know about the placebo. The second seminar was December 9th and 10th at Mass General. It was people who do shared decision-making in clinical guidelines in primary care. Their question was, how come the placebo effect is not mentioned when we talk to patients at all? Where is it in shared decision-making, and where is it in clinical guidelines that the government publishes? A lot of people from the government came. A lot of people from various different leading institutions in medicine came. This is the third seminar. As soon as the grant came in, I went to Dr. Kleinman, my mentor, to the extent that he'll acknowledge me as being a student. And I said, Arthur, would you please help me do something on ritual? I think it's a really important question around placebo. And I have to say, Art said, I'll do all 5 of the seminars. And that was a joke, but you didn't get it. And I said, no, just to help me do one. And so this is really Dr. Kleinman's inspiration, and it's really on the question of ritual prayer and how it's relevant interacts with the question of placebo effects in medicine. The fourth seminar is going to be May 21st. Charles Rosenberg, the distinguished historian of medicine, is going to be talking on placebo efficacy, a historian's perspective, and anyone who's come here will get information about that seminar. The fifth one will be with people at the business school on behavioral economics. How do you get people to perceive and make moves in directions that you think are helpful for them? And there'll be also participants with the psychology department at Faculty of Arts and Sciences. For this seminar, I just wanted to say there'll be a simple reception at the end of it. If you want to join us at the end of the seminar, it is going to be videotaped and will be available online. And I think that's all I had to say. I never talked in my life before Dr. Kleinman, so it's very hard to introduce Dr. Kleinman, but I just want to say Dr. Kleinman is a giant in the field of medical anthropology, psychiatry, medicine, and Asian studies. He has changed the way we think about those fields entirely. He's affected all kinds of research, all kinds of clinical care, and more broadly, how human beings think about themselves. And the entire rest of the seminar, Dr. Kleinman will chair and facilitate.
Thank you, Ted. Those were kind words. And it took me about a half a second after Ted told me what he was interested in doing to think of our guest for tonight as the speaker. And the way we'll organize this is to have you're going to hear an excellent talk, and then followed by that you'll have commentary from Ann Harrington, Ted Kapchuk, and myself, and we'll open it up to questions at that time. And I think we'll have a chance for both the real classroom and then flipping in the classroom, as we now say. Well, it's a very substantial pleasure for me to introduce Tanya Luhrmann, who I've known for a long time, although when you look at her, she still looks like she's in her 20s. Tanya is a university professor at Stanford. She's an anthropologist who has worked in rather different areas and on very different subjects, from witchcraft in contemporary England to Parsis in Bombay. But she's best known, I believe, for her books, which include, for two books, which include Of Two Minds, an ethnography of contemporary psychiatric training in psychiatry, which I think It's one of the great books on psychiatry in American society. And her more recent book, When God Talks Back, about Pentecostals in the United States, in which I think virtually every review that came out of this book begins by saying, here is an outstanding academic who treats religion seriously. And so that's part of what makes, I think, Tanya Luhrmann unusual, that she brings a substantial academic apparatus to this area. She's both a medical anthropologist and an anthropologist of religion, but she carries it lightly and engages major themes, as you'll see, and brings in very different kinds of areas. And so what could be more interesting as a theater setting than to have her address placebos and prayer? Let me ask her to come forward, and please join me in welcoming Professor Luhrmann.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me see if I can fix the... Look at that. So, it's great to be here. These are the haunts of my youth, and it's wonderful to be back. It's also great because I'm just at the beginning of trying to understand the health implications of prayer practice, and I welcome the opportunity we'll have to talk. I want to begin by pointing out that I think that placebo is a terrible word. It suggests a false intervention with a surprising outcome. I prefer, with Anne Harrington, to see our topic as a rich human story, a deep human story, which is about the engagement of humans with symbols. And I'm going to talk about one such engagement today, which is prayer. And let me begin by saying that I understand my task today to be secularist, and your interest to be secularist. I'm not ruling out the possibility that there is a supernaturalist explanation for the power of prayer, but it is simply not what I'm going to be engaging with today. I'm going to be talking about the practices of prayer that may make it helpful for us, independent of the presence of God. So these are folks who are praying. They're evangelical Christians. They put a lot of weight on prayer, but many Americans pray. 88% of Americans, I actually think this lowballs the number of Americans who utter brief prayers, and many of them engage in these sort of conversational prayers with God. Okay, one of the things we know is that going to church confers health benefits. There's an enormous amount of literature. If you want to get a sense of the range of it, I would suggest looking at some of Harold Koenig's big handbooks on spirituality and healing, spirituality and health. But there's some things that seem to be pretty robust. Going to church adds some years to your life, it improves your immune system, and it lowers your blood pressure. So most of the work which generates this data is done with church attendance as the single variable to identify religious participation. And you can ask, why should this be true? Why should going to church be good for you? And there are at least two commonsensical answers. One is that if you go to church, you're immediately part of a social community. And that's really true. You show up at church, you become a member of the group, you fall ill, people bring you dinner, they call to take you to the doctor, they check in on you. You really do have a new social network when you go to one of these integrated communities. And the second obvious point is that that we know to be true is that if you're a church member, for most churches, you're probably engaging in less risky behavior. You're probably drinking less, smoking less, engaging in less risky sex. That's all, in general, probably good for you. I want to talk about something that doesn't enter into the big data sets quite as much, but increasingly we're finding evidence for it. I want to talk about prayer, and I want particularly to talk about prayer as an emotion management system. I am an anthropologist first and foremost, and so most of what I'll be talking about today will be my observations of the people that I've spent time with. At the end of the talk, I'll end with a little quantitative data to make my point, well, which I hope will make my point. So what do people do when they pray? Well, they do a lot of stuff. They recite memorized prayers. They ask God for material things. They talk to God in their own words. They ask for forgiveness. They give thanks. They ask for guidance. They sit quietly thinking about God. They do a bunch of stuff. This is the most famous Christian prayer. And I should say that I am hoping that much of what I say applies to prayer, many prayers more generally. And in fact, that's the subject of my current writing to try to make that claim. My data come from my work with evangelical neo-Pentecostal Christians, and so that's what you'll hear me talk about today. But this is the Our Father. This is the way Jesus invited his disciples to pray. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we have also forgiven our debtors, and lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. So I want to begin by looking at the overt features of that prayer. And these are overt features that evangelicals would identify as the things that you should do when you pray. And again, I think this is true for evangelical prayers. I think it's true of many, many prayers across the religious spectrum. Prayers involve adoring God. They involve confessing your sin, describing the ways in which you have been fallen short. They involve thanking God, or, as I see it, remembering that the world in which you find yourself is good, that God has given you this world. Asking God for stuff. And charmingly, Anne Lamott recast this as thanks, wow, help, which captures something. And indeed, you can see those features in the Our Father when you go and look at its structure. What I want you to pay attention to now is the way prayer, what people do when they pray. And I want to invite you to think of prayer not the way secularists sometimes think of prayer as a kind of a request for stuff, and you often don't get the stuff, so it's this foolish activity, and what are people doing being so irrational? I want to invite you to think about prayer as a way of paying attention to your mind, as a metacognitive activity, as a way of thinking about thoughts. And what the central act of prayer, I suggest, is paying attention to inner experience, to thoughts and images and the awareness of the body, and treating those sensations as important in themselves rather than as distractions from the real business of living. And Simone Weil captured this in a lovely phrase: prayer is only attention in its pure form. And I also want to take a moment to give my respects to Stanley Tambaya, who was one of my undergraduate teachers and who you have lost as a colleague recently. One of the things he taught me is that words and sentences are not just declarative and descriptive. They do things in the world. They act and they perform. And what I'm asking you to do this afternoon is to think about the performative activity of prayer. Look at the way that prayer acts in the world. And so now I want to look through three of those four overt features of prayer. And turn first to thanksgiving, or what I'll describe as God is good. So what I saw in my evangelicals as they prayed is a repeated, asserted attempt to focus on life as they knew it, and to see what was good in that experience, and to disattend to what was bad. And to people re-describe their troubles and enable them to think about them in different ways. So this is one of my favorite examples of this from an evangelical neo-Pentecostal woman. This is somebody in Chicago, and she's telling me a story, and she's describing how miserable the weather conditions are. It was like icy rain and gray and cold, and it was sleety. And what she prays is, God, I praise you that it stopped snowing and it's not accumulating, and that the streets aren't icy. This style of prayer can kind of drive you a little nuts when you spend time with people who pray like this. I mean, I just came back from Chennai where I was talking to people who talk to God, and somebody was going on and on about how his mother's operation, it was a testament to God because, she had a tumor and it was terrible and she was in pain for 6 months and all these people were worried and there was a big operation and they cut into her and the blood went all over the place. And the tumor was benign. And you can kind of think to yourself that there might have been other ways for God to show his mercy and his goodness, but it is striking as a practice that people draw their attention to a positive redescription of the world in which they find themselves. You see moving examples of this in the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. So one of my favorite examples, this is Job. The Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Well, Job says this after his land has been blasted apart and he's lost all his animals. He has lost his wealth. He is nevertheless able to feel confident thanking God. This will not last for Job. And one of the things that is striking about prayer and is striking about therapy in general is that it doesn't always work. But but what you see is the effort to redirect your attention and to remind yourself of what is good. One of the prayer practices I find quite moving in Judaism is the mourner's Kaddish. When somebody loses his father, he is asked to come and pray with a group of 10 people, a minyan, and to recite a prayer in which, in effect, he's acknowledging that the being who's ultimately responsible for the devastating loss in his life is nevertheless a being who he recognizes to be good and sanctified and who creates the world as he willed. Well, what I want to do is to remind you that these are the mechanisms of cognitive behavioral therapy, which is the therapy with the best empirical support of all our psychotherapies. Cognitive behavioral therapy asks you to identify the bad thoughts that spring up in your mind, seemingly unwilled. I'm not smart and I'm not worthy. I can't make it without my God. I can't make it without my dad. Sorry for the slip. You're asked to recognize the irrationality of that sentence. Your therapist will sit with you and have you write down those sentences that come into your mind, to look at the sentences, to evaluate whether they make any sense, and then to practice coming up with better sentences that you can use to replace them when the bad sentences float into your mind. Overt feature number 2, confession. One of the things that you see when people pray is that they pay scrupulous attention to their immediate past. Again, from a secular perspective, you sometimes think of confession as confessing the terrible things that you did, dreadful things that you promise not to do again. In practice, confession tends to be much more micromanagement. People think about what they did in the last 6 hours, in the last 12 days. They think about that they cast into words their behavior during this period, and they resolve to do differently. 20 years from now is great, but they resolve to do differently tomorrow. And what you see is they're both casting their experience into language and setting low, achievable goals. I won't have dessert tomorrow. One of my examples from one of my evangelicals, the biggest thing that'll get me praying is like my stress level with my life. So everything that's going on, because I feel like I try to handle everything myself, or I try only to see like I can only see what's kind of going on right now. So I need to pray and I give it to God and I say okay, I need help. I can't do this. What she's actually doing is reminding herself, reminding herself of some piece of micro behavior in her life that makes her anxious, stressed. She talks about it. She talks about it with God. She resolves to do it differently. And what is striking is that the prayer practice is so focused on the intimate and the particular. This is true not only for the evangelicals, but in one of the more famous Jesuit prayers, the Examen. Those who go through the Ignatian spiritual exercises, and Jesuits in general, are asked to make an exacting account of their self from the last time they did the examen, which is somewhere between 6 and 24 hours ago, and the moment. And they're going through these events in their mind's eye, talking about them, casting them into language. So what I want to suggest is that this prayer practice operates on the same principle of what we know makes therapy effective. It casts experience into language. It gives you a sense of control over the experience and helps you to feel, in many cases, more comfortable with it. We know this is the general mechanism in cognitive behavioral therapy and psychodynamic psychotherapy. James Pennebaker is a psychologist who's provided empirical support for the observation that when people write things down and re-describe their experience, they feel better. I also think that this is one of the basic insights of symbolic anthropology, that casting experience into symbols gives people a sense of control and mastery. And again, it sets small, manageable goals. Finally, supplication. One of the things that's more particular about the evangelicals with whom I spent time, and is also more particular at different times in the history of the Christian church, is that when people say help, they say help for particular little precise items. So the evangelicals I spent time with were very clear that you got to ask for help all the time. So here's a man who says, I often think that we get God's attention, and then what do? We don't ask. And they would invite people to ask, to pray about everything. Don't ask God for a car, ask God for a red car. Pray to God about a haircut. Pray to God about a shirt you might want. Pray to God about the little, you want to talk to God about where you're applying to go to college. You want to talk to, and one of my favorite examples is a young woman who was taking the MCATs, and she said, God doesn't want to know that you want to pass. God wants a number, and he wants it often. One of my favorite examples, again, of small prayer. This is a woman who said to me, well, once I prayed for an empty bus. It was like the 4th of July fireworks downtown. I was like, Lord, we need an empty bus. And then when the next one pulls up, it was totally empty, because we couldn't get on any of the other ones. So what I want to suggest is that this does what Ted Kaptchuk suggests that placebo does at its most basic. It externalizes hope. And this is why, he has this brilliant paper in which he talks about the fact that he gave people placebos, told them that they were placebos and they had no medical benefit, but that people often felt better when they took the placebos, and they helped. One of the things that you see these prayer practices do is that people externalize hope, and they talk about what they want and would like repeatedly from morning till night. The more you pray about, the more you make hope visible to yourself. All right. So those are the first 3 overt features of prayer: thanks, confession, supplication, focusing on the positive, organizing the past, setting goals, externalizing hope. All of them involved cognitive reframing. All of them involved metacognitive practice. All of them work, we know according to the therapeutic literature, whether you involve God or not. Now I want to turn to the 4th, which is adoration. And the claim that I want to make here is that adoration is different. It involves the acquisition of a loving social relationship. And I think, this is my claim, I don't think that this does anything for you unless to some extent you believe that that relationship is real. Now, there's a deep discussion about what it means to have a real relationship with God and how real God is for you. We know that you can give kids in like a war zone puppies, these huggy puppies, plush puppies to hug, and the kids who get the plush puggies, the huggy puppy, plush huggy puppy. Anyway, the kids who get the stuffed dogs, they have less PTSD down the line than the same kids who don't get those dogs. So in some sense, you need very little in order to generate some kind of a relationship. But I think that I want to make the claim that the more real the relationship is, the more powerful the act of adoration becomes. And I want to suggest that experiencing God as real is hard. At least experiencing God at least feeling that God is real in an experienced real way, an experienced near way. God, not that an abstract idea that there is a God, that God is ultimately responsible, but the idea that the promise of joy that you hear from the pulpit really applies to you, that God is standing with you, that you will feel his love, that he is by your side. That is difficult. It's not obvious that it's difficult to secular observers, and one of the new spate of books that I think are fabulous from evolutionary psychology has sort of sharpened that sense that belief is easy by suggesting that there's something about belief that's hardwired. And this is the argument that suggests that the way that our cognitive structure, our apparatus has evolved is such that when we think quickly, naturally, and automatically, we're more likely to imagine the presence of an invisible agent. And the argument is that our ancestors, if they heard an ambiguous sound and they took it to be a predator and they responded to it, they were more likely to live, even though like 95% of the time it's just the wind. But those that worried about it, they were more likely to survive. We have inherited a cognitive apparatus in which when we think quickly and intuitively, the idea of an invisible agent feels kind of plausible. That's true. But it is also true that our cognitive development has really evolved so that we feel comfortable with the material world as we find it. And in that material world, minds are private, persons are visible, and love is conditional upon right behavior. What I want to suggest is that abstract belief is easy, and perhaps evolutionary psychology helps us to understand why that should be the case. But to feel that God is close and present is hard. And when you begin to observe that, you can begin to see that you can begin to pay attention to the fact that when you walk into a church on Sunday morning, what the pastor is really doing is inviting you to take God seriously, to remind yourself that God is present, that you should include God within your thoughts, that God is somebody. People forget the presence of God, and to keep God aware requires work. I'm going to argue that the work of making God real is a significant contributor to the health benefits associated with religion. So, about 10 years ago, I set out to understand a style of spirituality that I thought would make the cognitive burden of belief most difficult. This is a style of spirituality in which God is deeply human. God is also deeply supernatural. That's true for all Christian and arguably for many, many faiths, but it has a particularly present quality for these evangelicals. The particular folks I was spending time with were a Vineyard Christian Fellowship. These are also called a new Paradigm Protestant Church, also called Charismatic Neo-Pentecostals. That's the formal name now given to them. These are churches in which combine a conservative theology with a liberal social style. They're Bible-based. People meet in gyms rather than in churches. They use a rock band, not a choir. They tend to be casual. They target the young. Men run everything. It's mostly white, mostly middle class. One of the striking things about these churches is that every person sitting in the church expects or should expect to experience God intimately, personally, and immediately. That's no longer reserved for people of special skills. Everybody gets to do God. I just want to give you a little bit of a feel of the way that God is imagined in a church like this. So God is a person. God will talk back. I mean, God, to some extent, talks back to all people who talk to God. But this is a really active active God who chats with you, who gossips with you, who wants to walk with you. To give you a feel about the way that the people talk about this, this is a book by an evangelicals intellectual. And Dallas Willard says that God's face-to-face conversations with Moses are the normal human life that God intended for us, which is quite a claim. This next is my favorite ethnographic artifact, Bob and Stan's Pocket Guide to Talking with God. And Bruce and Stan say, it's really important to understand that God is not an impersonal force. Even though he's invisible, God is personal, and he has all the characteristics of a person. He knows, he hears, he feels, and he speaks. God is also a substance in a church like this. You feel him in the warmth in your body, in the sense of electricity, sometimes in your goosebumps. And in the form of the Holy Spirit, God will move through you and can change you. He can move through a circle and conduct supernatural healing. He can sweep down the nave and knock you over. And he can twist your tongue so that you speak in a language-like sound that's not actually a language, but is understood by those who use it to be a spiritual language, which is only understood by God. So the question that I asked in doing my work was, how does somebody learn how to do this? Because I could see that they did learn how to do this. People would come into the church and say, I don't know how to talk to God. And 6 months later, they would say something like, I recognize God's voice the way I recognize my mom's voice on the phone. They talked as if God was intimate and present. So I did about two years of field work in Chicago and 2 years in Palo Alto, talking to people about their experience, going to church services, going to house groups, doing the Ignatian spiritual exercises with one of the groups. And I would say that what I learned through that ethnography was that the church invited you to experience God as intimately present in at least 3 ways. They invited you to acquire a new theory of mind, to play imaginatively with God, and they encouraged you to do a series of emotional practices through which you would begin to feel God's unconditional love. And so I'm quickly going to walk you through those and then talk to you about the stuff that didn't explain for me. So, at the Vineyard, you're invited to learn a new theory of mind. But you're really invited, and you are asked to think about your mind not as truly private, but as containing thoughts and images and sensations that you might once have understood as self-generated, but in fact now you're going to understand as given to you by God, as God's word in your mind. Here's an example. Somebody who says, she's talking to me, so I'm praying for someone, and they describe their situation, what they want me to pray for. I start praying and start trying to, really experience God, and I see these vivid images, and I'm explaining these vivid images and what I think they mean, and sort of checking in with a person, does this resonate with you? And they're like, oh my gosh, yes. How did you know that? And so this is describing somebody who is praying for another person. And so if I were praying for Arthur, I would be praying, and I would get these images would pop into my mind, and they wouldn't feel like they were mine. But when I began speaking them out loud to Arthur, if they moved Arthur, then I would know that God had given them to me to share with him, to give him what he needed in the prayer experience. And then people generalize from that, and they begin to recognize these thoughts that emerge as God's words in their mind. People are also invited to pretend that God is present. Let's Pretend is actually the title of a chapter in a book by C.S. Lewis, Mere Christianity. Lewis says, let us pretend in order to experience as real. And congregants in these churches, they go for walks with God. They have dinner with God, they have beer with God, they have a cup of coffee with God. My favorite example of pretending that God is present is date night. This is a woman who says, I'll set aside times where I'll have date night with God, especially when the weather is really nice and I can go to the park and I can take a Subway sandwich with me and just sit there. It's almost like a conversation then when we're talking about his children and we're talking about what's going on in my life, what he's doing in the world, that sort of thing. So you pretend that God is present. You're also invited to engage in a series of emotional practices that you can see at the church happening around you. And really the point of these practices is to allow yourself to experience God as unconditionally loving. And I'll share with you one of these, praying in the presence of God. So this is a prayer circle, prayer huddle. There's somebody in the middle, typically who is crying. This person is in distress, otherwise they wouldn't be in the center of the prayer circle. People around them are, in effect, standing in for God and saying things like, Lord, we hold up Larry to you. We pray that he feel embraced by the warm comfort of your everlasting love. And they say these things to remind Larry, or whoever is in the center, that Larry is unconditionally loved, that he should reach out and feel God's present love. All right. So I want to draw your attention to what an enormous amount of social work is involved here. It's the church that directs the congregant's attention, the church that's teaching the discernment, that's encouraging the play, that's modeling the emotional practices. And they teach people to override these expectations of a private mind, a person's being visible, love being conditional. That's all important. It didn't account for everything that I saw. I thought that I saw that the learning process changed something about the experience of mind as well as the content. And that's what I want to talk about now. Not everybody was able to do this. Not everybody was able to feel God as intimately and personally present. So here is young Jake, who says, I remember desperately wanting to draw closer to God and to have one of those inspired Holy Spirit moments. I wanted those experiences and I sought them out, but I never found myself encountering them. Irene, I don't understand the gift of prophecy completely. I probably never will, and I don't have it, and I don't want it because it would scare me. I figure about 25% of the church found it difficult to do the stuff that you were supposed to do, to feel God intimately and immediately. I was also struck by the fact that people have repeatedly said, you've got to pray to experience God. You want to know God? You've got to pray. And what they were talking about was this imagination-rich prayer in which people are throwing themselves in a daydream and trying to have a back and forth conversation with God over their 2 coffee cups. They said that prayer is hard to learn, takes practice. What's hard to learn is to experience the daydream as not being mere imagination, but as being something more real. They would say that some people are better than others. And they would say that the ones who are good and who practice, they're going to change. And they said a couple of things about that change. Some of the things you'd expect them to say about their increased piety, but they said that their mental image got better, their mental imagery got sharper, which is not something that you say to make other people think that you're a worthy believer. And they reported more unusual sensory experience. And just to give you a feel of that, these are the kinds of things that people would say. Recently, when I was praying for someone, I heard a voice, it was outside of myself, say, put your hand on her head and pray. Somebody else. The Lord spoke to me clearly in April, like May or April, to start a school. You heard this audibly? Yeah. Were you alone? Yeah. I was just praying. I wasn't praying anything really. I was just thinking about God. And I heard, start a school. Immediately, I got up and it was like, okay, Lord, where? So let me quickly disabuse you of the thought that these are psychotic. In my experience, the psychotic hallucinations tend to involve many, many words. They go on for sentences and paragraphs. They are very frequent. People experience them throughout the day, and they are often highly distressing. People hear terrible, terrible things. When people report what I call sensory overrides, what they hear is brief, I will always be with you. Start a school. These are rare experiences. People typically remember 1 or 2, if they have them at all, and they're startling, but they're not disturbing. So, you're driving down the street, and you hear God speak in the seat behind you and say, "I will always be with you." It's a little freaky, but it's a very wonderful thing to experience. So, my ethnographic observation suggested to me that there was a story here about proclivity. Some people were more likely to experience God as intimately and with all his stuff than others. And that there was a story about training, that practice helped people to experience God as vivid and as present. So at this point, I shifted my methods. This was in the Chicago church. I talked to 28 congregants about God, prayer, and spiritual experience. I gave them a psychological questionnaire, about which more later. I went through their what they said, their interviews, and I pulled out the characteristics of what it was to be a really expert prayer who had a great relationship with God, because those went together. And then I judged each transcript against this profile, a scale, if you will, of the characteristics of being a prayer warrior, an expert prayer. And I correlated the results with a questionnaire. And the questionnaire I was using is something called the Tellegen Absorption Scale. This is a scale of 34 items. It asks you to say true or false, is this true for me? And the items are like this. Sometimes I feel and experience things as I did as a child. I can be greatly moved by eloquent or poetic language. Watching a movie, a TV show, or a play, I may become so involved that I'll forget about myself and my surroundings and experience the story as if it were real. There's only one question, one statement on this scale that has anything to do with religion. And I think that what it captures is the capacity to focus attention on a non-instrumental object, often an interior object, and to disattend to the exterior surround and to take joy in the experience. People who say yes or true to a lot of these items, they love getting caught up in their imagination. These are readers and dancers and folks who love to love to go for long walks with God. Anyway. And these are the results that I found. There was a clear relationship between the way somebody scored themselves on the absorption scale and whether they regarded God with sensory vividness, whether they reported that God ever spoke to them in a way that they could hear with their ears, or that they'd seen the tip of an angel's wing, and how vividly present God was to them as a person. And then when I controlled for absorption, it turned out that the length of time that people spent praying then predicted whether God was present to them as a person. So I then did this slightly ridiculous project. So a project that was a blend of what a psychologist would do and what an anthropologist would do. I wanted to look more closely at training. And we brought over 100 people into my office for a spiritual disciplines project from churches like the Vineyard and local neo-Pentecostal churches. We gave them a set of questionnaires. We gave them a set of computer tasks. We interviewed them. I have 13,000 pages of transcript data. This is why a psychologist would never do that. But in any event, that's what the anthropologist did. We then randomized them to, I'll talk about two different conditions. Everybody got an iPod. Everybody was asked to spend half an hour listening to their iPod 6 days a week, 4 days a week, 6 days a week for 4 weeks. One of those iPads, in one condition, you were listening to terrific lectures from the teaching company about the Gospels. Really all about Jesus as a person, for that matter. In the other condition, I had created some daydream-like encounters with God that I'd modeled on my understanding of evangelical prayer and on the Ignatian spiritual exercises, which again I'd done in an evangelical context. And people were asked to listen to the track and experience an encounter with God. So they go out for a month, they come back in, and we repeat many of these same measures. So what we found was this. So first of all, we found the same proclivity effects. Absorption is associated with unusual sensory phenomena, and it's associated with subjective mental imagery vividness. And we also found a bunch of training effects. So the folks in the prayer condition, on average, we asked everybody directly, did you feel that your mental images were sharper this month? Folks in the prayer condition were more likely to say yes. We'd given them this little exercise where they had to sort of imagine things and then tell us how vivid things were. And on average, the folks in the prayer condition, they reported more vivid imagery. We gave them a series of tasks in which we were looking at the ways in which people were using mental imagery or paying attention to visual search on a computer screen. And on average, a little bit, the folks in the prayer condition, they did better. And they had more cool, weird experience. So we'd asked everybody whether they'd ever experienced they'd ever heard a voice when they were alone, or they'd ever seen something that other people couldn't see. And then we send them out. So we were priming everybody to have kind of weird experiences. We send them out, we bring them back in, we ask them those questions again, and we looked at the people who reported, who had told us that they'd had such an experience once a year or less often over the course of their life. And we coded what they told the interviewer, and on average, the folks in the prayer condition were more likely to say that they had one of those odd little sensory experiences in which they hear something, they see something that's not materially real in the world. They were also more likely to say that they felt that in the prayer condition, they're also more likely to say that God was near tangibly present, that their sense of God had changed, that they felt more playful with God, that they experienced God more as a person, that their spirituality had changed, that their emotions were different, and they reported, a variety of weird, cool spiritual experiences. So, what I see that describing is, or what I infer as a result of this work, is that inner sense cultivation changes mental experience. So these prayer practices where you're paying attention to your mental imagery, to your thoughts, to your daydreams in which you're interacting with God, that's changing your mental experience of engaging in the event. And there is something that sort of travels together that involves sharper mental imagery, stronger visual attention, use of mental imagery, an unusual sensory experience, and probably emotional richness that seems to work together, arguably to help people experience God as real. And when you look back in the ethnographic and the historical literature, in fact, what you see is that in the ethnographic record, shamanism and spirit possession, these are folks who engage in what you could call inner sense cultivation. Richard Noll wrote a lovely piece about that. On the historical record, periods when people have cultivated imagery to experience God are also periods in which people have had visions of God and reported God's immediate and intimate presence. So, what does that have to do with placebo? Well, I want to talk about the classic anthropological argument for symbolic healing. So Tom Shortis actually does a better job of this, but this is James Dow laid out this as a model with bullet points earlier, and so I'm using his 4-point model. This is anthropologists often teach this in their introduction to anthropology or medical anthropology courses. How does healing work? This non-modern healing where people aren't using pharmacologically active pills and they're not doing surgery, but they're using healing practices that seem to have some impact on the body. We think, at least these are the common features of healing practices around the world. And Dow laid out these 4 dimensions, that the experience of the healer and the healed they've got to share the same ideas about symbols. The healer's got to persuade the patient that the symbol is relevant. The healer has to attach the patient's distress to the symbol, and that's got to be emotionally resonant for the patient. And then the healer's going to do something to the symbol, and that's going to change the patient's experience. I think this is a fine model, and I think there's a reason it has such classic authoritative status. But I don't think it works at all unless the patient believes that the symbol is real. And I think that that's what you're seeing in these prayer practices that allow God to become more real for the person who is praying and playing. And so this is my little bit of quantitative data. So in this big project that we did, we had a question in which we asked people to indicate their degree of agreement with the statement, "I feel God's love for me directly." One sentence. and we gave people, a Likert scale. You could, from 1 to 7, how much is this true for you? And it turned out that silly little sentence, the way people responded to that silly little sentence, was significantly related. Well, so the more they said yes, the less psychiatric vulnerability they displayed, at least measured by a classic, simple measure of psychiatric vulnerability. The less lonely they felt, the less stressed they said that they were, and the more satisfied they were with life. So if this sense of feeling loved by God does have health consequences, I'm going to bet that there are 2 contributing factors here. One is absorption trance hypnosis. So absorption is the more common of these experiences. The trance, dissociation, hypnosis are more high-end, specialized, concentrated experiences, and all of these things kind of correlate significantly, but not a perfect overlap. It turns out that in some of the literature that's available and out there, absorption is associated with an improved response to complementary and alternative medicine. And in some of the placebo work, absorption is used as a pen and paper measure of hypnotizability, although that's not quite perfect. And again, that seems to be associated with a better response to placebo input. Spiegel and Spiegel summarize a lot of this. So there's something about activating your capacity to shift your attention. There's something very different that's going on in activating the attachment system, or what I would call the attachment system, and being able to experience God as a social relationship. One of the most robust things that we know about the vulnerability to poor health outcomes, this is really John Cassiopo's work and others. Being lonely is a terrible cost. Has a terrible cost to your immune system, your immune function, your cardiac function. Having a good relationship with God keeps you less lonely. So so the task of the person who prays to be able to experience God as real is to make God real in the moment, and also to make God good, to create a social relationship that involves love, protection, and comfort. I think it's a reasonable chance that people who are high in absorption and have a terrible relationship with God would find that relationship more costly, and they would be more at risk for, say, PTSD if they encounter a bad trauma. So, in sum, how does prayer work as a placebo? Well, 3 of these overt features are metacognitive behaviors that identify and change negative thought, organize experience, set achievable goals, they externalize hope. Adoration teaches you, if you can adore God, and you are making real and making good this important social relationship. Let me end with this slide, which is that actually I'm now trying to not only write about prayer, but write about prayer more generally as a system of managing emotion, as a way of handling human emotion. It's striking that this is sort of absent in many of the classic texts that talk about religion. Religion is an explanation. Religion is a way of creating social identity. Religion is a way of, is a projection of parents because we're so terrified of death. It is striking that we have not paid attention to the way in which religion manages human emotional experience. And I just wanted to take a moment to say that this was something that I learned from Arthur, that one of the things that I think that Arthur Kleinman has taught his students is that the most important thing to understand in thinking about human behavior is that you look first at the emotions, look first at human suffering, and you look at what people do to alleviate their pain. So I'll close there. Thank you.
Let me invite all the other discussants up to the front here. So we'll begin with Ann Harrington. Ann Harrington is professor of the history of science. As I look around the room, there are a lot of people who know Ann here very well. She's done some marvelous work on the on the borders of how contemporary science, together with medicine, relate to some of the phenomena that we've seen. She's worked with traditional Chinese medicine, amongst other things, with healing, and was a marvelous leader of the mind-brain society activity that pulled many people together at Harvard to look at how the social world, the subjective experience, and physiology related. Anne.
Thank you very much. We've all just been given so many sort of ingredients for a fantastic conversation by Tanya. Talked about ways in which we might be able to understand the efficacy, the healing efficacy, the health-enhancing efficacy of prayer in terms of as a kind of psychotherapy by other means, relevant, related to, that works according to principles similar to CBT or dynamic psychiatry, psychodynamic psychotherapy. Tanya's emphasized the importance of practice, hard practice. It's hard to get there, and it takes time to get there. But the goal of having an experience of God, a personal relationship with God, in turn can activate certain kinds of emotional and maybe even physiological changes that are health enhancing. And she called attention to enhanced better blood pressure, enhanced immune response, stress reduction. But there was one slide, Tanya, in your talk that you went by rather quickly, but I want to pick up on as a way into some reflections that I hope will not particularly challenge anything you've said, but maybe just open it up or broaden it out a little bit. It was the slide on supernatural healing. On miracles healing, on miraculous, dramatic healings within the context of the church. Healings that I presume you take as seriously as every other aspect of the religious experience of your interlocutors, but that feels a bit more dramatic and different than the kinds of enhanced capacities for emotional resilience or better immune response that you were emphasizing in the rest of your talk. But that also clearly should be part of our conversation about placebo, ritual, and prayer. So I wanted to see if we could tease out what some of the issues here might be, where these kinds of healings, supernatural healings, dramatic, maybe miracle healings, fit into your larger way of thinking about the placebogenic effects of living an intensely prayerful life. And I thought I would anchor this interest or this question to you in a site that I've spent just a little bit of time at, not really as an anthropologist because I'm an historian of medicine, but nevertheless that I spent some time on, and that's the Catholic Healing Shrine of Lourdes down in southwestern France in the Pyrenees Mountains. All of you will have heard of Lourdes. It's the most famous Catholic healing shrine in Christendom, probably, certainly in European Christendom. And it's been interesting to me for at least three reasons that seem kind of relevant to our conversation here. And the first, most obvious reason is because of its history as a site of repeated, dramatic, and in quite a few instances, apparently inexplicable, or at least very unusual healings that go back now some 150 years. They've been happening ever since a 14-year-old peasant girl named Bernadette, following instructions from an intensely visualized image of a mysterious lady, a hallucination or whatever. She called her a beautiful lady, a vision. An unusual sensory experience, but directed by this image, she discovers a previously unknown spring of fresh water in a grotto, and healings begin within days at that grotto. So that's one reason it seems interesting to this conversation. It also is interesting to me in terms of this conversation because it's a place of intense, often highly ritualized and emotionally resonant prayer. As well as of intense, highly ritualized prayer-like rituals, bathing, drinking, singing, processions, and collective blessings, all done in an intensely prayerful sort of a way. There's all the elements that you identified in the evangelical tradition of adoration, confession, supplication, thanksgiving. So it's all there, but it basically is the fabric and texture of this community. It defines, in a sense, the sanctuary, this sense of an intense prayerful community. So that's the second reason it's interesting, I think, for us. The third reason it's interesting to me and might be interesting to all of us is that it has something which makes it possible to ask questions about both individual and collective experiences of miracle healings over time. It has an archive. It has an archive that contains currently more than 7,000 dossiers of both clinical reports, third-person witnesses, and first-person narratives of the experience of having a miracle healing at Lourdes. Now, the reason it exists is that in the 1880s, against the backdrop of increasing skepticism from up in Paris, doctors, most believing doctors, Catholic doctors down in France, set up an office in the sanctuary at Lourdes, whose charge it would be to intensively investigate the many, many claims for miracle healings that were being proffered at that time, in order, in a sense, to kind of discipline and keep things from getting out of control. People have to bring their petition to the office, and then doctors investigate it, materials are gathered, and all of this has been preserved. Now, people suggest that it's probably no more than 10% of the total number of healings, and I don't even know where they get that number, but they say it's a fraction of the people who actually have a healing are willing to go to the office, but still 7,000 records add up to a pretty significant pool of data. Now, I've spent a little bit of time, not nearly enough, but a little bit of time at Lourdes and in that archive over the last 18 months, and as I looked at we were sent her PowerPoint in advance, so I had to sort of try to figure out what you were going to say. As I sort of looked through your PowerPoint, I began to think about how far your model of prayer practice, placebo, and healing might be able to help me understand what I thought I was seeing down at Lourdes. And so I want to share just a few thoughts and then end with a question for you. The first thought, or the first reflection, is the similarities. And particularly the similarities around your descriptions of what happened in these churches when the Holy Spirit grabs people and throws them to the ground or heals them. The experience that's intensely physical of something like described as electricity or heat. You find that all over the place in the archives. There's people who have an alleged miracle healing at Lourdes often will talk first about feeling intense pain and often cold, and this often happens when they're put into the water. There's a ritual of bathing in the quite cold, usually waters at the grotto. But then they will often describe sensations of electricity, like energy coursing through their body, or intense heat, just before they experience some kind of a acute change in their sense of well-being, and they know, I'm well again. They also, a lot like your people, often experience unusual sensory experiences shortly before the healing. People talk, for example, about like the statue in my hotel room. The statue of the Virgin spoke to me and told me, go down to the grotto. Or I was in a closed room and or I was in the church or in a closed space and a wind blew across the room. Or I heard something, in my voice saying, it's going to be all right, and reduced me to tears, and I knew it wasn't me. So that's very similar in a lot of ways. But there were also aspects of things that seemed to happen at Lourdes that I thought began to diverge a little bit from your model, and that I'm curious about, inviting you to think about. And the most striking for me is the lack of emphasis you see down at Lourdes on practice, on the need to practice.
But they've taken a long time to get to Lourdes.
Well, so we should talk, because it isn't that there isn't a process, but that the idea that many people will talk about the fact that they weren't particularly believing before. Let me think. I mean, I'm not saying that there isn't, that this couldn't all be reconciled. But there isn't a sense, these things happen, within often a few days of arriving. People sometimes are brought by family members, somewhat resistant, and then their prayerful life, their religious life often happens as a consequence of having an experience. And what they talk about, more than the hard, agentful work of practice, is surrender. A kind of surrender to the will of God, a surrender also, maybe this is where I'm particularly interested in thinking with you about this, a surrender to the community, to this intensely prayerful collective community, and not just the clergy. I have been really, really struck by the important role played by the huge number of healthy pilgrims who go to Lourdes, not because they're seeking healing for themselves, but in order to serve the sick people there. And even though I'm not an anthropologist, I have spent some time kind of watching this over the last 18 months, and it's my impression, and this is similar to some of the things you said in your talk, and I'll say why in a moment, but it's my impression that this hard work of summoning divine presence at Lourdes is in some sense more the responsibility of the healthy people than it is the sick. The sick are the recipients of the hard work that's carried out by the healthy. So you see them literally carried to the waters by the volunteers and submerged as they say the prayers over them, a little bit like your prayer circles. Or they're pushed in wheelchairs in these huge processions, and their caretakers carry the candles and chant the prayers of penitence and thanks. So maybe I'm interested in how we can talk more about the community and its role in enabling these individual experiences of in both intense presence of God and of, in some instances, dramatic healing. And I'm interested also in how far, as we think about the community, we could also maybe try to expand the way we think about health improvement to make room for things beyond the psychotherapeutic and even beyond the kind of immune system, stress reduction, blood pressure level of discourse, to make room for some of these much more dramatic kinds of experiences that at Lourdes are really part of its bread and butter reality.
Thank you. I've asked Professor Lerman to respond after we have all the comments, and then we'll open it up to questions. And let's now turn to Ted Kapchuk. And Ted really deserves a bit of introduction, since this whole thing is his idea. Ted is a professor at Harvard Medical School. He has had for a Harvard Medical School professor an unusual, or even I would say singular, trajectory. His degree was in traditional Chinese medicine, and which was and is part of his practice of healing. But he himself has made himself, over the course of several decades, probably the principal researcher on placebo in the United States, and one of the principal ones worldwide. And his work on placebo research is regarded as the standard, not just for placebo research, but for the investigation of complementary and alternative medicines. And he's probably also the recipient of most of the funds from the National Center for Complementary and Alternative Medicine at the NIH. Well, it gives me a great deal of pleasure to introduce and have Ted respond.
Thank you very much. So the reason that I was so excited when Arthur said, let's have Tanya Lorman come do something about placebo, because I know the word placebo doesn't, maybe it appears once, but I don't think it appears in your book at all, was that what you're doing and what Anna's even and what this seminar is about is how do people perceive and feel? And you're doing it around the question of the divine. And I'm dealing with it as a placebo researcher around the question of health and illness, symptoms and complaints. That's the first thing I want to say. There's a real question. What's the similarities and what's the differences? I wanted to say that your first slide said it was an awful word. It's a terrible word. That's because placebos are inert, right? The cellulose or saline injections, and they obviously don't have effects. That would be an oxymoron. What a placebo is, I think, is a surrogate marker for everything that surrounds the pills, which biomedicine doesn't like to have great discourses on, but it's basically the symbols, rituals, and the therapeutic encounter. It's a way of actually trying to measure that. It's biomedicine tries to exclude that with randomized controlled trials, but they came back to haunt. That's the first thing I want to say. Second thing I want to say, I want to give, because I want to take only 10 minutes, is I want to do one thing where I think placebo is different than what Tanya talked about, and one way it's very, very similar. The way it's different is really around the question of training, which is what Anne alluded to. When I looked at the pictures in your slides, you have these wonderful contemplative pictures where people are looking inwards, really reflecting, praying, praising God in a quiet kind of quiet contemplative prayer. And there are other pictures that are more performative, theatrical, speaking in tongues, slain in the spirit, reaching up for the divine inflow. And I wanted to say that there's a continuum there, but I think that placebo is on the continuum with the performative theater, and what 19th century Christian missionaries would call superstition, or what anthropologists and missionaries would call magic and popular religion in the 19th century. And I wanted to say that the training, and Anne alluded to too, I think that prayer takes an enormous amount of training. When people say they want to visit my synagogue in Cambridge, I say, when's the last time you were in a synagogue? And say, well, I never was there 5 years or 10 years ago. And they say, what time does service begin? I say 9, but you can't come to 11 because you don't have the liturgical muscles to get through that and not go crazy, because that takes practice, hard work, right? So that's the work question. And what I wanted to say, that placebos are effortless, automatic, and happen without any practice. Because why? Obviously, they have to. You can't go from one culture to another to do a medical ritual, or at least not until the New Age happened. But basically, the work of my team has been basically, we take medical condition and we look at the bells and whistles of biomedicine, the rituals, the symbols, the doctor-patient interaction, and vary one variable, and give people sugar pills or saline injections or whatever. And what we do is we found that by just changing identical patients, for instance, in our paper in 206 in BMJ, we took identical patients with similar patients with chronic arm pain. They can't open their wrists from playing music or computers. And we gave some of them placebo needles and randomized the other half to placebo pills. We got the people who had the placebo needles had a much greater reduction in pain. The people who had the placebo pills had better sleep, right? Just changing that little variable, because nothing else was changing in the experiment. In the experiment we did in 208 in BMJ, we gave people placebos, but we didn't let them interact with the physician or the provider. We called it a limited interaction, very business-like. This is it. I've read your charts, take it. And then we had the other people randomized to this is an irritable bowel syndrome, randomized to a very supportive, warm, enthusiastic practitioner who would ask them, how do you think you have this? What causes this illness? What's your experiences? How do you manage to navigate your daily life? Really nice kind of supportive, attentive listening, even 20 seconds of thoughtful silence. Let me think about this. And we found that the people who had this, and they got the same placebo treatment, placebo needles. We found that the people who got the augmented schmaltzy intervention, real supportive, did dramatically better, clinically significantly better than the people who got the limited placebo. But the people who had just the placebo did much better than no treatment control too. So that was interesting. I think I'll do one more example. We just published a paper last month in Science Translational Medicine. We took 450 migraine attacks. We bought 450 migraine attacks in patients, and we gave them either drug, Maxwell, placebo, or And and for 6 of the attacks, we wrote different words on the envelope. This is a placebo. This is either a drug or placebo. And this envelope said it's the drug. And by just changing the word, no other intervention, we were able to show dramatic differences. For example, if they took the pill, which is a very effective medicine, and took the pill and it was a placebo pill, we wrote down the word Maxalt, the name of the drug, they had a good effect. When we gave them the Maxalt, the drug, and told them it was a placebo on the envelope, it had the same effect, no difference. We took out the placebo effect from the pharmacology. When we gave them the drug and told them it was a drug, it doubled the effect of the drug. This is really not training. This is one word change. Obviously, there's real cultural assumptions behind it, which very deeply embedded. But in this culture, we're able to change 3 words and show an amazingly complicated variance in what happens between a drug and a placebo. So I want to say that I think there's effortlessness. That's the difference that I see. The similarity I see is, unfortunately, you didn't use it in your talk, but I read your book twice. The word discernment is very important. And discernment, I think, is really critical in discerning the divine and discerning how you're feeling, what are your perceptions of illness and health, and probably many other kinds of perceptions. And discernment is, you mentioned the evolutionary thing. For example, if acute discernment is you're in a forest that has lots of snakes and you see something that looks like a stick or a snake, you see a snake. You actually see in your brain a snake. That's right. It's with cognitive science we call error processing, right? In order for evolution to, it's evolutionary beneficial to see that as a threat, and then you say, oh, it's a stick, I made a mistake. That's, I think, what happens in acute models of placebo research, which I'm involved in also, but in the chronic models, which are much more interesting to me because that's about real patients in real time over time, the question of discernment is really important. And I want Eric Jacobson's here. We embedded him in one of our studies, an anthropologist, and he interviewed patients at the beginning, middle, and end on one of our studies, and he asked them, "Are you getting better?" And this is a study they knew could either have placebo or a real treatment. And they go, I've been wondering about that. And then they say, maybe I'm making this up all in my head. These are direct quotes from patients. I want to see if this works. I'm going to try to eat, this is irritable bowel patients. I'm going to try to have a salad tomorrow to see if I'm better. And what you see is that they're always looking for what in your book you called incremental, constant incremental decisions. Is this real? Is this not real? Is this who I am? Is this not what I am? And maybe I'm making it up in my head. These are words that came out of your book and came out of Eric's embedded study in one of our studies. And I think that kind of discernment is very similar, because here's an example of one paper that we did in New England Journal 2 years ago. We gave people 400, we bought 400, over 450 asthma attacks. We took people off the medication, made them feel bad. We paid them a lot of money. And then we gave them albuterol, the drug that makes them breathe better, or placebo albuterol, a fake inhalator, or fake acupuncture, or no treatment control, just sit there for 2 hours. And when we asked them on a 10-point scale, how much better do you feel? This is like 450 headaches, asthma attacks or asthma discomfort. There was no difference between the real drug and the 2 different placebos, and they were dramatically better than no treatment, right? Their perceptions, their discernment was no difference. When we also measured their objective capacity to breathe with a machine, there was a very big reduction, improvement with the real drug, and a very small improvement with the placebo, 2 placebos, but the reduction in the placebos was no different than just sitting there. There was no placebo effect. When you hand over the instruments, the meters of discernment to a machine, you don't see what's invisible and intangible. It's really a human, and that study suggests that the placebo primarily, or at least significantly, is about the mechanisms we have for discerning our feelings and perceptions. And finally, I just want to say, I really thank you for saying that real weird study that I gave. We've done this now 2 more times, giving people placebos and telling them it's placebos, and we keep getting a hit, which we find it hard to believe that they do get much better than the controls. it's not belief there. I think it's 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 it may be, but I think it's just the enactment of the ritual. The performance itself is moving people to perceive differently, and it's not. It may be certainly it's cognitive involvement, but our job in on those 3 studies was to suspend disbelief, not to create disbelief. We had to acknowledge no one's really going to think a sugar pill works, but it somehow or another happens. Those things have to be replicated, of course. But those are my comments. Where I see a real difference around effortlessness and a real similarity around the question of discernment.
Thank you, Ted. I don't want to use too much time because I want to get the responses from those of you who've been good enough to sit through all this and hear, I think, not just a marvelous lecture from Tanya, but some terrific comments. My own interests are really no longer, frankly, in the area of healing and placebos. I've been interested primarily in the last decade or so in caregiving and what caregiving is about. And how it relates to this is that, first of all, many of the things that Tanya associated with the religious experience could in fact be seen as well in caregiving. And maybe one of the most extraordinary things in caregiving is presence, is whether you're present to the person or mechanical to the person you're taking care of. And an extraordinary dimension of family caregiving is how frequently family members doing the most mundane of tasks, washing, bathing, feeding, ambulating, toileting, etc., are actually present to the person who is being cared for. That they bring forth their personhood in this. This is not done mechanically. I mean, there are those, of course, who do it mechanically, and there are plenty who run away from this. But amongst family caregivers, it's surprising to see how many are present in this way. And I'd say that, again, presence enters this domain that we're talking about, whatever it is. So it's not just placebos and religion. It's a broad domain. And for me, that part of the domain that's significant is, in fact, this idea that caregiving is as fundamental a human experience as we can think about. We care for the elderly, but we also care for children. We care for the disabled. We care for the sick. We professionally engage in care, but virtually all of us have the practical, on-the-ground experience of caregiving. And I think that's what we should begin to bring these aspects of commentary and lecture together about. So something on the level of interactions, of meanings, of perceptions, of embodiment, that the person who's caring, who is doing the caregiving, as well as the person who's receiving the care, are not just isolated psychological structures. They are human beings, psychophysiologically, but they're culturally embedded. They're embedded in culture, and culture has come into them as the social world has come into them. So that present is not just a series of psychological processes, but that social world and those cultural meanings. And I'm going to then just sort of leave it at that with one last commentary. It's always, as a medical educator, it's always struck me as odd that medical students are taught in a way that you pay attention to placebos as it may be unethical for you to use something as a placebo, and B, if you're interested in research, you better learn something about placebos in order to do the appropriate controls in research. You would think that at the very least, medical schools would train physicians, and nursing schools would train nurses to be the most splendid elicitors of placebo outcomes, so that at the very least, not only would they do no harm, but they might actually do some good. Okay, I'm going to leave it at that and open it up to questions. Let's try to make the questions pointed and the like. But before I do that, actually, I want to ask Tanya to respond to the various things that have been said, and then we'll go directly into questions, and just keep them short and focused.
So I'll be quite brief. So I was putting together a new model of placebo while people were talking. And it seems to me that one of the things I had tucked expectation into my metacognitive discussion, it seems clear that that is separate unto itself. I mean, we could clearly have a conversation about how much training is involved with culture, but that's a different thing. There's something kind of really special and set apart about simply the expectation of healing. I think there is a story about the therapeutic metacognitive attention paid to the mind. I think that there is one of the things that I cut out, but because it's so hard to think about, but now needs to go back and is to think about intense emotion, because it is clear that overwhelming intense emotion is powerful in therapy. It's powerful in healing. It's one of the things that rituals really try to drive up, and that should be set apart. The story about absorption. So this is something I'm trying to wrap my mind around. I think that there are these cool, weird, powerful sensory experiences that travel together. And the farther you go out on that sensory edge, the more people are likely to experience things that are powerfully different about their body. I think there's a story to be told about people who are prepared to respond. That's a William James story. But I'm not at all surprised that dramatic changes have precursors of feeling special breezes or, an angel floats through. The sense of presence. So there's a story that I'm very interested in trying to map out experiences of absorption and cool, weird stuff about the world and the way in which they work together and become more or less important in different social settings. I have to say that of those powerful experiences, presence strikes me as one of the most important and least understood. So you were talking about presence in a slightly different way, but I'm not sold that it's actually so different. So when I have this phenomenological interview that I give to people about God, and one of the things that is so interesting is the way in which God serves as a presence or not. And there's a lot to say about that, whether God is present and sits in a particular place, whether God lingers in the room, whether God is thick around the person and they carry God with them even when God goes away. I think that this is a whole domain of neuroscience, ethnography, psychology, palliative care that deserves an enormous amount of attention that we haven't yet given it. So attachment, presence, so 5 items. Attachment, presence, intense emotion, absorption, cool, weird stuff, metacognitive stuff, and expectation would now be my new revised model of placebo.
Let's have questions from Tom. Introduce yourself, Tom. So we'll. Yeah. Do we have a
Microphone down here.
Yeah.
Joey, when you bring down the microphone here. Okay,
bring it right
bring
over
it
here.
down.
Thanks. Just bring that down. Tom, just introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm Tom Delbanco. I'm a crusty old internist who's known Arthur and forever and Ted almost forever. And I've long loved the placebo. Meaning the best way to get Arthur out of my office is to give him a pill and say, you'll be fine, and you get out and I could see the next patient. So we've long understood the placebo, I think. I'm confused by you guys and fascinated, and want to lay onto you yet another variable, which is the one that's fascinating me these days, which is transparency. I've been involved in an experiment in which we're inviting patients to read everything we write about them, and care partners and caregivers. And we think this is going to be powerful medicine, placebo or not, over time as we try and draw closer to the people we serve. I'm confused about practice. As you talked about activating the attachment system, I immediately thought of 3 things, 2 of which I enjoy a lot. One of them was Brahms. I happen to play the violin, and I'm very attached to Brahms, and the more I work at it and the more I try and partner with him, the better I get at doing him. The other one, which I also like, I won't go into details, is sex. And the third one, which I don't like so much, but which I can see I'd get better at if I tried it a lot, is violence. All of those things take practice to get good at. You need to be attached to various different things that you believe in, whether it's in a community where violence keeps you alive, or whether it's in bed where sex keeps you alive, or whether it's with the violin when Brahms keeps you alive. You have to work at all those things. Also, you have those sudden illuminations as if you're lured. My God, what he meant by that phrasing was forget the bar line and go into the next phrase and you're going to be fine. So I think they all play. They're all confusing to me because I'm a doctor and not a social scientist. But I know that what will bring it all together in some way or not is transparency and placebos.
My interest in practice is simply that God is not automatically real, that to make God real requires work, and that work requires attending to the mind. And I think one of my greatest contributions is in this domain of pointing out that when you attend to mental experience, you change that mental experience in particular ways, and it's a real and significant change. And practice by itself leads to there are lots of things you can practice.
Now I'm going to pass, Tom. Will you forgive me? I pass. I think you're raising very important issues about experience and being moved by experience and then reflecting on them. And I think I have to think about it.
But the way you put it, Tom, I think is very much in keeping with what the panel has been talking about. It's a Jamesian approach, emphasizing verbs rather than nouns. It's the actions, it's the doing, it's the movement through. The same thing that, if we think of enduring, much of life is about enduring, but enduring is not just an idea, it's the actual living through that which, we don't want to live through, but have to live through. And I think that all of these things are about what William James asked for, which was a practice of doing it. What is the doing, not just the thinking about it. And the doings, as we heard from Tanya earlier, and we've heard on the panel, is often this unreflective doing. It's not necessarily involved in the thinking about it, so that the very meanings associated with it are the meanings in practice. And that gets us back to the point that Tanya made, the wonderful point of remembering Stanley Tambaya. Stanley Tambaya was a great anthropologist. And in his career, both in his ethnographic field research and in his marvelous book, Magic, Science, Religion, and the Scope of Rationality, Tambi talked about participatory rationality, a kind of rationality very different than what happens in a university, but has to do with the ways that we participate in life. And his argument was to bring what Dow later made into sort of a very schematic view of putting meanings together with cultural meanings together with personal attachments and moving them through symbolically, so that at the beginning you symbolically announce what the problem is, then you transfer it in the actions of healing, and then you announce it as something else at the end. Tambi saw that as central to all ritual process. And what you heard distilled here, I thought quite brilliantly by Tanya, was an enormous amount of anthropological work on what rituals are about, summarized very, very quickly, just like she did the placebo stuff. Let's have other.
So what I would like to say is that the use of the verb, I'm a notorious editor, as Ted can tell you, is that you like the active verb rather than the passive one. I couldn't agree
absolutely.
more. Okay.
Yes, for sure. Yes. Did you want to respond to this also? Yeah.
Well, I only if we have a second.
Take this. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
We had Tanya and I had a little teeny argument sort of while I was making my comments. I said something about the way in which at Lourdes there's not an emphasis on practice. We seem to be all talking about practice and how to think about it and what it might mean. And you said, well, wait, but of course there's a lot of preparation, and that often is true. But it's not what the sort of thing you were saying where you have to work hard. It's a kind of, there's a whole kind of process of incubation, you might say, or, I don't think expectation, that's too cognitive for me to quite capture what it is. I mean, back in the late 19th century, the neurologist Martin Charcot wrote a kind of famous essay on the faith cure. He was as secular as they come, but he started sending patients to Lourdes because it worked. And he wrote the very last article he ever wrote in 1893, attempted to try to make sense of why it worked, and he emphasized the long train journey. And the long period of time to get the money to actually be able to afford, and then a 20-hour train journey, and then how tired you are, and then you're in the hotel, and then you meet all the people, and you get sort of swept up in the crowds, and it works on you. And it isn't, but that doesn't feel like practice. It does feel like something.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I was only trying to look at the health benefits of prayer. I was not actually
Too.
trying
I mean,
to
I think because the prayer is
summarize everything.
happening at Lourdes, and it's all about prayer. It isn't really about the water,
There's
although.
no reason why practice can't simply be getting into the cold water. I mean, practice doesn't have to be a disciplinary practice that you spend hours and hours on. It can be just a momentary.
Well, then that begins to feel there's space.
Yeah, I think we're talking about the same things. Let's have. I really want to get more responses. Yeah, Eric, introduce yourself.
I'm Eric Jacobson, and I'm a longtime student of Arthur's and Ted's. Tanya gave a beautiful description of all the things that the religious group provides to the individual and guides the individual in what you call emotional management. And has a kind of psychological health benefit. And the thing that I'm wondering about is you could think of that as a dependency of the individual in the group. You could think of that as what's the word compensation, a compensatory system, that it's psychologically functional for the individual to participate in all these things. But then the issue is, how dependent is the person? I just wonder what you think about this on the group. Clearly, there are groups that foster that kind of dependence. We all know that. That's the popular use of the word cult, which is somewhat corrupted from what we anthropologists mean by it. But then, in the West, since the Enlightenment, there's a big value on the individual's ability to say, I'm an individual and I disagree, and I'm going to walk away from this group and be independent. Now, there are groups that foster that too. So what do you just think about that dynamic? Healing as dependence on the group, or healing as a kind of healing that you also can walk away and still be healed?
I mean, that's a good question. I don't have a good answer. I think there are many, many factors involved in healing experience for different people at different times. I mean, sometimes there are cascades that are hard to understand. Sometimes there are slow increments. Sometimes switching the needle with a pill makes a difference. In general, one of what I would like to contribute to the discussion is the recognition that God works as a social actor for the people who are able to experience him that way. And that's not always obvious from a secularist perspective. If God is working as a social actor for somebody, they're depending upon God. That is in a Christian context. That is the way in which they're imagining it. I do think that the social organization of the church makes a big difference to how powerful a social community is. So many Protestant churches do not have a very rich social community. Somebody once gave me a statistic that people change churches every 5 years in California. It's Catholic churches are famously much more incorporative in their sense of the community, and the emphasis is placed upon one has a relationship with God, but really one is much more aware of being a brothers and sisters with Christ, and so churches have very different understandings of what it is to be in a community. I don't think there's a simple answer as to what model provides the best health outcome.
Over here, yes.
Hi, I'm Colleen. I'm a student at Boston University, and I was just wondering, both models, placebo and prayer, require a presupposing capacity to believe in something. But you see there are quite a few people who really want to change and really want to believe in something, but just can't do it. And Lehrman's model of practice seems to be a way to cultivate that capacity, that ability to believe in something. But do you really think or what are your thoughts on whether someone really has agency and whether they become able to change and believe in something? Do you think they have any control? Do you think they have any say in that? Or is it just, I don't know, I guess it could be argued like by the evolutionary psychology approach of like a part of the brain that makes it able to happen, but what are your thoughts?
If we were able to solve that problem, we would do away with psychotherapy, psychiatry, and all of addiction, all of the problems with addiction. I think it's a great, complicated question. I do think that one of the techniques that's used in the religious context is the technique is the AA model. You give up, you recognize your own inability, but you create yourself as a means to cure yourself. You could say that from a religious perspective, you give up your own, you give your inability to God, and God cares for you. But I would also see that you would have to enable yourself to experience some of that agency, to externalize the agency and allow yourself to be managed by it.
Let's take a few more questions over here.
It's actually a question and a suggestion off that last comment. If you look at social network analysis, people look at how ideas spread, and people have been looking at how ideas can cause pathologies such as obesity, and it matters, or depression, other cognitive problems, and it matters how many degrees of separation away from you a person likewise has it. So similarly, like how many degrees of separation away from you somebody who has actually undergone a faith healing experience might matter. And the spread of that idea, the absorption of that perspective on a deep, deep level, not on a necessarily conscious academic level, might be fundamental to that.
Yeah. I think that's a terrific comment. The Chinese have the term ranqing guanxi, meaning that interpersonal relationships are not just you scratch my back, I scratch your back. They can be based in, not that they are all the time, they can be based in moral feeling in which the engagement with the other is meant to be encouraging and doing good for the other as basic to the relationship, as the basis of a relationship. In fact, I think that's the best model there is of caregiving, that caregiving is about doing good in the world. And what we're hearing here is taking a naive term like that, doing good in the world, and putting it into more complex ideas. But I think beneath everything we're saying, there's some very simple realities that we all can associate with. How about some more comments? Yes, over here, right here. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Jonathan Morgan. I'm also a student at Boston University. Thank you all.
Oh, we're really attracted to BU students
I
here
know.
today. Where are the Harvard students?
And it's cold. We came up.
You're here too. Last two questions from Harvard.
I guess I have two questions kind of attached to each other. The first is using the model of psychotherapy and different types of psychotherapy to understand prayer. I'm curious whether prayer and psychotherapy are the same sort of animal. And so I guess that's my first question is how similar are they? And my second question kind of springing from that is what differences might we be missing by using that model and some of the kind of implicit biomedical assumptions that it carries?
I'm not sure that prayer does carry that psychotherapy does carry biomedical assumptions apart from what you might call the assumption that it is focused on the materialist explanation and a materialist intervention. And so obviously if you think about prayer in a non-supernaturalist way, that misses an important part of the prayer for people who are using prayer. So I think that there are these really interesting similarities between prayer practice and psychotherapy and a variety of psychotherapy practices that I wasn't able to really all fill out today. And what is similar about them is the way that they become systems of managing anxiety and distress and personal pain. They are psychotherapy typically doesn't include a lot of stuff that prayer does include. Psychotherapy, one of the big differences between psychotherapy and prayer, bold brush stroke, and this is actually something that some of my evangelicals would say to me, is that if God works for you as a therapist, it's fabulous. But God is also all pure transference, because God is invisible, and you see God through the structure of yourself. Somebody said to me, God can never say something to you that you wouldn't naturally expect. And so the woman who said that to me said that it was helpful to also have a human therapist, because her human therapist she didn't particularly like, because she could lie to him. And she couldn't lie to God. But her human therapist would tell her things that she would never think up on her own.
Great. I think that's a terrific way to end. I want to thank Tanya Lerman very much for the stimulating.
Is it, and the section outside of the-
I'll